And it's great to be sharing with you guys. And we're continuing our series called The Incarnation, Discovering the Beauty of God Putting on Skin. That's Matt's simplified version for Jesus coming forth. I think it's good, just God putting on skin. But I guess to get things started, I have a question. Have you ever had an indescribable moment? I think it in your minds, right, of these indescribable moments. One thing that I think that I'm really grateful for is that I can't read minds. So I don't know what these indescribable moments are. And I'm really glad I can't read minds because I feel like I make this guy's face all the time. There's no bigger fear I have than to read people's mind. That would be the worst because I feel like I couldn't turn it off. So it would be so hard. So I'm really glad I can't read your mind to find out what those indescribable moments are. But I'm sure we've all had them. We've all had these moments that you just can't put into words. And one for me, you can see the photo there. That's my oldest son, Caleb, who's now, oh my gosh, he's turning 13 this week.
8-year-old.
I'm too old, I know, Caleb. I'm too old. But this is when Caleb was born, so I was a 19-year-old kid. What's funny to me is I've had two other kids since Caleb, Gideon and Esther, and I can remember their birth, I can write down their birth, I can tell people about it, but no matter how hard I try, I can't get Caleb's. It was this indescribable moment for me. And for me, like, as much as I've tried to write it down, I've tried to formulate, all right, this is what happened when Caleb was born. We did this, and then this, and then this. I never get it right. The details are never perfect. There's always something that I'm missing. There's always something that I didn't remember. Or even worse, there's something I just can't put into words. I don't know how. It's just indescribable. And I feel like in the Gospel of Mark had one of these moments. I think Mark had something that was indescribable to him. Because the Gospel of Mark has no birth story. There's nothing about the birth of Christ. Which I think is really surprising, especially when we realize that the Gospel of Mark was the earliest written Gospel account. That's one of the few things, and Naomi can agree with me, that theology-wise, people don't debate over. And that's rare. If you study any theology, you find out people just argue with each other. It's like a bunch of lawyers trapped in a courtroom, and they're just endlessly arguing with each other. There's always this other side. But for some reason, with this one thing, no one argues about it. Mark's Gospel is the earliest written account. The first person to put pen to paper, well, they didn't have pens back then. You get what I mean. The first person to write it down. And he doesn't write about Jesus being born. The whole reason we celebrate Christmas is the birth of Christ, but Mark doesn't write it down. And what's even more odd about this is Mark's Gospel, it was used by Matthew and Luke's Gospel. There's a theological term called the Synoptic Gospels. Basically, it's this term that shows us how Matthew and Luke, it's pretty clear that they've used some of Mark. So at some point, Mark's Gospel must have been sitting there and they're writing their own and they're kind of using what Mark wrote and taking that out. And there's also another source that they seem to use that no one knows what it is. They call it Q. Don't worry about Q. It's just this mysterious source that somehow connects Matthew and Luke, and that's a whole other big topic. But I just find this really peculiar. That in the first Gospel written, a Gospel later used to write two other Gospels doesn't have the birth story. Seems to me that for whatever reason, because I'm not Mark, he couldn't describe it. It was this indescribable thing. And if you don't know, if you open up the Gospel of Mark, it's pretty interesting. You have this stuff about John the Baptist with some camel skin hair that he likes to wear, and how he has this weird diet, and how he's preparing the way. And then in verse 9, we read about this, after we get a little bit of understanding of who the John the Baptist is and what he's doing and how he's baptizing people and how he's preparing the way and how there's someone greater, we read this. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tested by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now, that's really cool. We could dive into how beautiful that is and how there's so much in it. But I think for me, the thing that surprises me is that Mark skips over the whole birth story of Jesus Christ. And he fast forwards to the baptism, which is pretty much after Jesus comes out of the wilderness, his ministry really gets going. So for some reason, Mark skips it off. It's like, now I'm going to write the gospel down for the first time. Should probably write about Jesus' birth. Now I'll just skip that bit. We'll just get to the baptism. What? Why? Why? You know, if we really think about it, why would you do something like that? I'm a logical person. That doesn't seem logically like a good idea, right? It seems like if you're writing about the Messiah, people are going to care about how he was born, who his parents were. In Jewish teaching, there's a genealogy that the Messiah was supposed to come out of. So you would think Mark would be like, all right, I got to nail this down real quick so people know. But he doesn't. That's because I believe for Mark, the birth of Jesus was the indescribable incarnation. Now, before you throw anything at me, because I just said, the birth of Jesus was this indescribable incarnation, I want you to bear with me for a minute. And let's go back to where our story begins in Genesis 1. And let's read what we find in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, how our Bible opens. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep. And while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. I find this amazing. Because, in science, they always talk about the Big Bang, right? This big explosion that happens. But no one can say what caused the big explosion. I think as Christians, what I believe is God caused the Big Bang. The Big Bang was God saying, "Let there be light," without an exclamation point. He didn't even have to raise his voice. I mean, just think about that. He didn't have to yell it. He didn't have to scream it. That fascinates me as a parent, because I don't know why, my kids just listen better when my voice gets a bit higher for some reason. But God makes the whole universe. No exclamation point. He just says, "Let there be light." And our universe came out of God's mouth. Wow. I mean, does that give you chills just thinking about that? This God being speaks, and the universe comes. The Big Bang, this explosion that science still can't figure out. They're trying to figure out the God particle that made it all happen. God particle was just God opening up his mouth, saying, "Let there be light." And that's the God who put on skin. And that's indescribable, if you ask me. And if you don't think it is, I got some science for you about our universe. Because I'm one of those weird Christians. I don't mind science. I like science sometimes. But I got some science about our universe. Did you know our universe is still expanding? So scientifically, our universe, don't ask me how. Ask God, maybe he can tell you how he did it. But somehow God's so good, and he speaks, this endless universe keeps expanding. The observable universe is about 93 billion light years. took 1 billion light years. And it's still expanding. And that came out of God's mouth. And what's crazy to me is I tried this week to see if anyone figured out how. I'm like, maybe you could travel to the end. Maybe there's a way I could look up how long it would take to travel to the end of the universe. And it's amazing when we find out that we can't travel to the end of our universe. Even if we developed light speed travel, right? So even if we could travel at the speed of light, we couldn't. Because by the time we got there, it would have expanded. Seriously? That is amazing. That God, our God, spoke and it happened. Never-ending, expanding universe is created by the spoken word of God, where he doesn't even raise his voice. Man, you can see why this might be indescribable for Mark. Because the God who spoke our endless universe into existence and put on skin, he put on skin through a teenage pregnancy out of wedlock. The Virgin Mary was a teenager. She was young. Scholar, that's what we found out. She was a teenager betrothed. She wasn't yet married. Not only that, they're first-time parents without heaps of money. And that's how God's going to put on skin? The God who could speak an endless universe into existence? Seriously? That's indescribable, if you ask me. And I think it was for Mark. I don't think Mark left it out of his gospel by choice. I think he couldn't write it down. I think for Mark, spending time with Jesus, seeing what Jesus did, being one of Jesus' disciples, when it came to trying to write down the birth story, it was just indescribable. He couldn't get pen to paper on that. He couldn't put it into words. He didn't forget about it. He didn't think it wasn't important. I believe he just couldn't write it down. It was this indescribable moment for him. And I think sometimes as Christians, we need to be okay with the birth of Jesus being the indescribable incarnation. Because, I just pointed out how, God, what he chose, through a teenager, first-time parents, all this stuff out of wedlock, they weren't married yet. That's just some factors. I mean, we're not getting into how a God who's infinite somehow puts on skin. How crazy is that to think about? There's no formula we can come up with to get it right. But that's okay. It's okay that it's indescribable. We need to get lost in the indescribableness this Christmas season. Yeah, I made a word. That's not a word. So all the hyphens there. I was like, it's got to be a word, and it's not. And, you can blame George Bush for my creative words. He was a president in the States, and he made up words. And as soon as I found that out as a kid, my English teachers hated me. So I'm like, what? If the president can do it, I can make up words. But we need to get lost in the indescribableness this Christmas season. And that's something I do now, because at first, when I couldn't write down my son Caleb's birth story, I couldn't get it right, I couldn't get all the facts right, I used to think, man, I'm a horrible dad. What kind of dad can't get the birth right from his first kid? Man, maybe I don't care about him enough. Oh, what am I doing? I used to beat myself up. But I think now I'm just okay with it. I'm okay that it's this indescribable moment. This photo behind me, I don't even remember who took it. I don't remember what day. I just remember holding my first son. I don't remember how we left the hospital, but I remember as a 19-year-old kid, I was shocked that there was so little paperwork to walk out of a hospital with a baby. No one was checking on me or anything. I had this little tiny baby. I did drop him a couple of times, but he survived. That's good. I had a tough head. He had a tough head. Don't worry. God knew I wasn't quite ready. It's okay. It's this indescribable moment, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay to look at pictures like this and not remember who took it. Not remember what day it was. Was it the day he was born? Was it a day after? It's all a blur. Because it was this indescribable moment for me. I can't even remember who I called first, because my family's in the States. I can't remember who I called first. Only thing I remember is I did gross my brother Patrick out, because I went into too much detail, because, indescribable in the moment, I'm just caught up in everything. It's okay to have these indescribable moments. And I think we need to experience some this Christmas. By putting down our phones and getting lost in those moments where words and logic fail us. And I hope we can do that this Christmas. I know I get more and more upset, and I try not to do it myself when I take my kids out, but how often do you see families sitting down for dinner out, and they all have a phone? They all have a screen. Or it's Christmas dinner, and everyone quickly eats, and then they go back to an iPad in their room. We're missing so much. Let's put the phones down sometimes. Let's get lost in the moments where just words and logic fail us. Because that's okay. And that's nothing to be scared of. And I have something I'm going to show to you. My wife's going to be upset. She's not here. But it's a bit of a Bluey episode. Who has ever seen the kids show Bluey? Oh, I like those hands going up. I like Bluey. So my favorite episode of Bluey is this one that's the rain episode. Now I love this episode. My kids hate it because there's not talking. There's not much talking. There's like a couple of times. But I'm not going to play the whole episode. And you'll have to forgive me for the recording because I couldn't buy the digital copy yet, so I had to set up my iPad and record it. And then so we'll see, hopefully sound quality is good. But basically, so you know what's happened so far. The mom, Chili, and Bluey are at home, and it starts raining. So the mom does what any brilliant mom does. They rush to get the clothes off the lawn. They rush to clean and try to keep the house clean. Kids do what any kid does when it rains, and they play in the rain. And then they come in and out of the house in the rain, and mom's left trying to clean it up. And you have this moment I want to play for you. If you want to see the rest, you have to watch that episode. But I love that. I love that. That's an indescribable moment. Words and logic fail. If you watch the whole episode, you'll see that there's towels that this little kid has got to try to make the newspaper that he's got to stay there. The towels were the mom trying to give it to him to dry off before he came in. And for me, I've never found anything that describes getting lost in an indescribable moment more than that. And I hope we can do that this Christmas season. I hope we'll be okay with that. We'll get lost in the indescribableness this Christmas as we celebrate the indescribable incarnation. The God who spoke our endless universe into existence, putting on skin. To make a way for all of us. To show us how much he loves. Now, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Loved the world, that's why he did it. And this indescribable moment. So let's get lost in that indescribableness this Christmas. Let's put down our phones. Let's let words and logic go sometimes. And it's something I'm going to try to do because I love my phone just as much as the next person. Let's try to put them down. Let's get lost in some of the moments. I'm just going to close in prayer, and then our worship team is going to come back. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for putting on skin and being born. I thank you that no matter how hard I've tried, I can never describe it completely. I'm never going to fully understand how the God who spoke our endless universe into existence decided to be born as a baby in a manger to a family that didn't have lots of money, to a mom that was a teenager and first-time parents. I thank you so much for what you did. I pray that you'll help us remember that as we celebrate Christmas. I pray that as we get with family and loved ones, that you'll allow us to put down our phones and get lost in some of the moments where words and logic fail us. Thank you so much for who you are. Thank you so much for your indescribable incarnation and your amazing name.